So I think it's fair to say that over the years, I've used quite a lot of fountain pens. Admittedly, some of them are quite expensive, but normally I'm more excited to test out the cheap fountain pens than I am the expensive ones, and the pen that I have here is no exception. In fact, coming into this video, it had quite a lot to live up to, because I've had quite a lot of people ask me to review this pen, and some of the other reviews I've seen online have had nothing but glowing reviews. So, Jinhao 82. For what I can gather, this seems to be Jinhao's new, mid-range flagship pen. If you go on AliExpress and you type in Jinhao fountain pens, I'll guarantee that this is probably one of the top listings that will come up. I think the last time they made a pen sort of comparable to this was the Jinhao 992, and that pen, well, it was a bit of a disappointment, a bit of a flop. It was a nice pen, but it had quite a lot of flaws, which meant that the pens tended to crack. So, what about this pen? Well, off the bat, let me just say that this is probably one of the nicest looking Jinhaos that I've ever bought. I've always said that Jinhao pens, they are well built, but looks aren't always the top of their game. But this pen here, it is beautiful, especially in its red and gold trim, which is the one that I bought. I think this is probably one of the nicest pens that I own. Although after doing a bit of digging, as it turns out, it's probably a clone of the Sailor Pro Gear Slim. I know that both of them do look like generic fountain pens, but if you look at the dimensions and some of the more distinctive features, including this step down, they both seem to match up. So essentially, Jinhao have just gone in and they've cloned the pen, pretty much for one, except for the nib. And normally I'd say that's a real shame, because I like it when Jinhao does something a bit different, something a little bit crazy. But if anything, this pen is so good that it makes me want to buy an actual Sailor Pro Gear Slim, because after the month that I've been using this, I've come to really like it, and I really want to find out just how good the real deal, authentic, Japanese-made one is. So I guess at this point it's worth asking, well, why do I like this pen so much? And obviously there's a few reasons for it, but the big one among many is the aesthetics. I don't normally buy pens just for the aesthetics, it's just one small component of the pen at large, and in fact some of my other favourite pens are ones that look really ugly. I'm looking at you, Pilot Prera, but this one here, it is one of the nicest looking pens that I own. The finish of the trim is great, and the colour of the plastic is a nice deep and rich red. And the engravings on the band are about as good as they've ever been. Compare this to the Jinhao 992 of about 5 or 6 years ago, and the engravings are just so much better than they used to be. For $8, they've done an amazing job with the quality. And on top of that, I think one of the other things that Jinhao does really well, that some other fountain pen manufacturers don't do well, is that they make this pen in a million different colours with a million different trim options. So with these cheaper fountain pens, I always like to take advantage of that and get them in, well, a lot of different colours that I normally wouldn't. Most of my pens are admittedly either clear or black. I don't know, I like to stay a bit safe when I'm spending a lot of money on a pen. But with Jinhao's, I like to go a bit crazy, and I am glad that I did. I think my favourite is easily the red with the gold trim, but there's a lot of other combinations out there, and they look so great. So I'll be definitely picking up a few more of these sometime in the future, and I recommend if you are going to buy one of these, grab 2 or 3, get them in a few different colours because you won't regret it. Now in terms of pricing, the price will vary between vendors on AliExpress or eBay, but don't pay more than $10 for this. I think the normal range is about $5 to $8 depending on if the store's having a sale, and even though that this is a good fountain pen, don't pay more than about $10 for it. I paid about $8 for this, which is not that much for a fountain pen, but if I'd done a bit more digging, I probably could have had it for about 5 or 6. They're nice fountain pens, they're great value for money, but don't overpay for one. Now size-wise, it's certainly on the smaller end for fountain pens. It's not Pilot Prera small, but it's definitely in that range. Now uncapped, it's only 11 centimeters long, and that includes the nib, which is certainly on the smaller end. So every time that I use it, I always make sure to post it, and that takes it to a more usable 14 centimeters. 14 centimeters is very usable. It's just longer than a TWSBI Eco if you don't post it, and the TWSBI Eco is a pen that I use unposted. And the good thing is, this pen does post quite securely. In fact, if it didn't post securely and I had to use it with it unposted, I probably wouldn't be recommending this pen. The other reason why that I'd recommend that you post it is simply down to weight, because the pen by itself only weighs 10 grams, and that's definitely on the lighter side for a pen. But if you post it, that'll double it to 20, and 20 grams is a nice weight for a pen. And the good thing is the weight is pretty nicely distributed when you post it, because most of the weight for the cap is going to be right here at the bottom near the band. So when you post it, a lot of the weight is going to be resting between your thumb and index finger. And to me, that is really comfortable. That is probably the sweet spot for weight distribution. Not too back heavy, but not too front heavy. Overall, I just got to say it's a very nice pen to use, and I don't really have any complaints. The grip is comfortable, and the threads are fine enough that you aren't going to notice it, even though your thumb is generally going to rest on it. And even though the plastic is glossy, I haven't had too much issue with the pen being oily or slippery. My general benchmark these days is, can I write the script for this video using this pen without it being either uncomfortable or getting too slippery? And this script took a few hours to write and no issues whatsoever. Overall, a really nice, really comfortable pen to use. Obviously, if you don't like pens that are on the smaller end, you probably won't like this. But remember, I used a Pilot Prero for years. I loved that fountain pen, and this pen here, it is no exception. Obviously, though, we can't really thank Jinhao for all of this because all of the design work is down to the guys at the Sailor design department, and Jinhao have simply done a good adaptation of it. Again, all of this just makes me want to buy a proper Japanese one, because if the imitation can be this good, it makes me wonder just how good the real deal Japanese one can be. Now, quality-wise, they've also done a really good job here. Everything here is made to a very high standard. The threads are well formed, and they've taken the effort to add an O-ring to the thread section. As I understand it, it's usually there to prevent over-tightening of the barrel, and that can help prevent the barrel from cracking. With that said though, it's not a silver bullet, because I've heard some people report cracking, although in the month and a half that I've had this pen and that I've used it, pretty much every day, I haven't experienced any issues so far. The only real thing that I don't like about it is that we have metal on plastic threads. The section is metal and the threads in the barrel are plastic, and that can cause issues into the future because you can get excessive wearing on the plastic. But so far, I haven't seen any signs that the metal threads are starting to wear in on the plastic threads. Again, it's only been a month and a half, so that is an area that I will have to keep an eye out for. Now, because we have plated steel on plastic, even though we have an O-ring, I wouldn't suggest that you eyedrop this pen. Knowing me, and given that it is a cheap fountain pen, I probably would attempt it, but I wouldn't recommend that you do it. But if you really wanted to, you probably could, because from what I can tell, the back ring and the back piece of plastic forms a pretty tight seal. Definitely airtight, so if you wanted to eyedrop this pen, I'm not saying that you should, but if you wanted to, you probably could get away with doing it. But really, there's probably not too much reason to do so because it comes with a converter, and the converter holds a good amount of ink. It's about 1 milliliter, and with the stock nib, you probably won't be refilling this pen all that often. Which brings me to the topic of the nib. Can the nib complete what is turning out to be a really standout fountain pen? And in short, no, not really. Look, it's an okay nib, but the problem with it is the fountain pen body sets such a high standard that you would need a really good nib to complete it. And unfortunately, the nib, it's okay. Look, is it a good nib for a Chinese fountain pen? Yeah, sort of. Is it a good nib for an $8 fountain pen? Yes, probably. Are there better nibs on other Chinese fountain pens? Yes. Is it as good as a Pilot nib? No way. A Pilot nib is leagues better. Even if you spend $20 and get a Pilot Kakuno, that nib is going to be way better. Is it as good as other Jinhao nibs? And frankly, no, not really. The nib that we have here is the standard number 5 nib that I'm sure we're all familiar with. But the real question is, what nibs are we actually familiar with? Because I've been collecting Jinhao fountain pens for, 8 years now? And the nibs that you get on those old fountain pens look almost identical to the new ones, but performance-wise, they are nowhere near similar. Look, from 2016 to 2020-ish, we saw a huge rise in the quality of those nibs. It used to be every good nib that you'd get an average or a nib that flat out didn't work. By the time of the Jinhao 992, we got really good nibs with buttery smooth tipping. We got nibs that worked, I'd say at least 90% of the time. With this nib, however, It worked okay out of the box. I had to shim it because it was a little bit on the dry side, but they've done something and they made their nibs, I'd say, less enjoyable to use. And I think that's all down to the fact that the nibs these days, this nib and a few other modern Jinhao number 5 nibs, they're stiffer. And it comes down to the fact that, and I've measured this, the material for their stainless steel nibs, at least for their number 5 nibs, is about 10-15 microns thicker than it used to be. When you're writing, you'll notice that the new modern nibs are a lot stiffer, and frankly, they're a lot less enjoyable to write with. In short, I'm not a huge fan of it. Look, is it a bad nib by any stretch of the imagination? No. It was certainly on the dry side when it came out, and now that I've shimmed it, it writes a lot better. But do I enjoy it as much as I enjoy writing with my Jinhao 601, which I enjoy writing with a lot, and that features an older Jinhao nib which is a lot more flexible? I'd say no. The nibs are definitely not as enjoyable as they were a few years ago. Are they bad? No, but they're certainly not as fun as they used to be. Which is a real shame because I ripped the nib off the 992 and stuck it on this, and it was night and day. It was so much better with the older nib. I'll also be keeping an eye out on just how good their grinding process is these days, because the 992 nibs, they were very consistent, and they were very consistently very smooth and very well made. The more recent number 5 nibs, they're not bad nibs, but they do have a bit more feedback and scratch than I'm used to dealing with from Jinhao. Again, it's nothing that a bit of micro mesh can't fix, but it is nice to get nibs that work perfectly out of the box. It's also worth noting that the nib that I bought was a medium nib, which is a bit strange because Jinhao, at least from memory, they didn't used to offer their number 5 nibs in a medium size. It was always a fine or an extra fine. And I for one was a bit excited for that because I generally prefer medium nibs these days. However, what I got wasn't a medium nib. It's certainly much closer to a normal Chinese fine nib, and frankly, the fine nib on the 992 is a lot thicker and a lot smoother than the medium nib on this pen. At least the feed on this pen is good. Out of the box, as I said before, it was a little bit on the dry side. That's definitely down to the nib itself, and if you shim it a little bit, it will make the pen a lot wetter. So, Jinhao 82. How do we sum up this fountain pen? Well, for one, I had such high expectations coming into this video, but unfortunately, whilst the pen's body is absolutely standout and it's probably one of the better Chinese fountain pens that I've ever used, the nib, I'm a bit surprised at Jinhao. Their nibs from 5 years ago were pretty much perfect, and if they just stuck with those nibs, I'd easily be giving this pen, I don't know, a 9 or a 10 out of 10. But with the new Jinhao nibs, they're okay. You're probably going to be a bit disappointed, and you will probably want to swap the nib out of this pen the first chance that you get. And that brings me to sort of the second part of this review, because if you are going to get this pen and you are already into fountain pens, get this pen and get another number 5 nib and swap it out. What I've done is I've swapped this out for a TWSBI number 5 nib, and wow, can I just say this is probably my favourite fountain pen to use at the moment because, like I said before, the body of this fountain pen, it is perfect. I love the ergonomics. I love this fountain pen. I love using it. It's just the nib that was letting it down. And once you nib swap it, it is like a totally new fountain pen. The feed is good enough to keep up with the ink flow that the TWSBI nib demands. The only downside is you are going to be refilling it quite often, but not really a huge problem because the pen itself, it writes spectacularly. So that's pretty much it. If you're going to get this pen, I'd recommend that you just get a different nib to swap it out with. Get a Bock nib, get a Yovo nib, get something other than the stock nib. If you do that, you're going to end up with a fantastic pen to write with. And that's how I'll be using this pen for the time being. Anyway, let's get into a writing sample. I will be using the old stock nib because that's how I prefer to do it with my writing samples, just to give you an idea of how the stock nib is. Alright, welcome to the writing sample for the Jinhao 82. This has the medium stainless steel nib, and the ink that I'm using is Monteverde. I believe this is Ocean Noir. And like always, the paper I'm using is Rhodia. So, quick writing sample. And as you can see from the writing sample, no issues whatsoever. The nib works about as good as any good Chinese nib should work. Very little scratchiness in the nib, and as you can see, very little line variation. Now in terms of quick writing, and of course I'm not the world's fastest writer, but as you can see the feed keeps up perfectly fine. Any issues with this pen has nothing to do with the feed. I think the feed that they have settled on with these Jinhao pens works really well, and that includes if you nib swap this pen. So there's going to be no issues, if you swap over to a nib that requires a bit more ink. Now in terms of line variation, this is the pen with no pressure, and I'll slowly start to build up pressure. And as you can see, there is a bit of contrast between the thick and the thin, but I think a lot of it is just going to be the increased ink flow, because you can get a bit of flex in the nib itself. It'll flex upwards, but that doesn't really translate into it flexing sort of, outwards. So as you can see, not much pressure and about as much as I'd push it. And whilst there is contrast, as you can see, in normal everyday writing, you are going to see, much flex. And even if I slow down, it's really not hugely apparent. Now in terms of natural line variation in the nib itself, that's the downstrokes and that's the side strokes. I think the side strokes might be a little bit thinner, but again, it's not something that you're going to see a whole lot. In terms of wetness, the feed can keep up. It's probably on the wetter side for a Chinese, fine medium, as we'll see in a second, but not too wet, but it's not too dry, which is a good thing. In terms of reverse writing, it actually reverse writes a lot better than most pens do. It's actually quite smooth, which is pretty good. I never reverse write, but if you want to, this might be the pen for you. Overall, like I said, it's a good nib for a Chinese fountain pen. It's just not something that, is going to blow you away. It's definitely good value for $8, and if you maybe take a bit of micro mesh to it and smoothen it out a little bit more, you're going to end up with a pretty decent nib. Not as good as, say, the Yovo nib you'd find on a TwistBeat, but still a very nice nib. With that said, I still don't think that this nib is as good as some of the older Jinhaos which I've received in the past, and I'll show you why. First of all, the mediumness of this nib. It really doesn't feel like a medium nib. It feels like they've ground it like an old-fashioned fine nib, and they've just stamped medium on it by mistake, because this is the line that you get from a medium nib, and this is the line that you'll get from a Jinhao 992, which has a fine nib. And as you can see, they're pretty much identical. Although looking at it a little bit closer, I'd say that maybe the fine nib comes out a little bit thicker. This one here, obviously, Jinhao 992, which has a fantastic nib. The pen itself has cracking issues, and I think I can see the pen starting to crack now, but The nib itself is really good. These are the sort of nibs that you get on Jinhao pens of about, I'd say about 4 or 5 years ago. The thing that I really appreciated about these nibs is that you could get nice flex and contrast between the thick and the thin lines. And that is mostly down to the steel that they're using in these nibs to being a lot thinner and overall much more enjoyable to use. Once again, this is a Jinhao 601. This one here is probably 8 years old. And as you can see, very similar line thicknesses. Probably on par with the 82. Probably a little bit thinner than the 992. This again here is also a fine nib. And once again, it also uses the very thin steel, so you can get some fantastic line variation. I don't think it's as good as the 992. I think the 992 is probably the best that Jinhao have made so far, but this is still very nice to write with. So what I think I might do is nib swap this with the one out of the 82. Again, these nibs look so similar, pretty much identical, but having measured it, this one here is definitely made from thicker steel and it's not as fun to use. With that said though, this pen, like the pen body as a complete thing, is better. It's a much better buy. Not to say that the 601 is a bad pen. I actually quite enjoy it. But as a complete package and as a pen that I'd recommend, I'd probably say that this is a better buy than one of these.